happy. We look and see, in some of these commercials, I'll just be good to myself. I'll have a chocolate bar. Well, that chocolate bar might not make you be able to get up out of bed the next day, but we're not going to see that in the commercial. We're just going to say, I'll be good to myself. And then the next day when we have a hangover from the, too much sugar, that's not going to be shown.
Food Addiction is a podcast which explores the disease of food addiction and presents the solution. We interview professionals and counselors who specialize in the disease of food addiction, and we interview individuals who have successfully recovered from food addiction and discuss how they did it. Esther Helga Goodman-Stotier was motivated to change careers after she recovered from food addiction by opening a food addiction treatment center and the InFact School, the world's first and only sugar and food addiction counseling training, which offers a recognized certification. Check out the website for more information on obtaining this certification, as well as proven recovery programs at infactschool.com. Listen to these episodes as we discuss the problem and the solution around food addiction. Today on our podcast, Food Addiction, the Problem and the Solution, we host Dr. Debbie Danowski. Welcome, Debbie.
Thank you, Susan.
Really glad to have you here. I'm Susan Branscome. I am a recovered food addict and the host of this podcast. Debbie, we're going to introduce you with your bio, and we'll talk about your work and your books and your newest book, which is really good. So I'm going to introduce you with your bio, and then we'll dive into some questions. How's that?
Sounds good.
A recovering food addict, Dr. Debbie Danowski at one time weighed over 320 pounds. She experienced many years of trying every diet program imaginable, leaving her feeling exhausted, miserable, and hopeless. Today, she celebrates 34 years in recovery from food addiction and has maintained a 170-pound weight loss after she went through a food addiction recovery treatment program. She realized the connection between using food and her emotions. She learned to overcome her food addiction, and she began and continues to work a 12-step program. She has written more than 100 articles for national and local publications and is a nationally renowned speaker about food addiction and has spoken at many meetings and conferences. Dr. Danowski has received a master's degree from Syracuse University in public communications with an emphasis on radio and film, and she also received her PhD in education with a focus on media. You can find more about Dr. Danowski at her website, debbiedanowski.com. And I'm going to go over the books that she's written. Her first book, it's called Why Can't I Stop Eating? Recognizing, Understanding, and Overcoming Food Addiction. Next one is The Emotional Eater's Book of Inspiration, 90 Truths You Need to Know to Overcome Your Food Addiction. And I read part of this book, and it was pretty profound, all of the 90 truths. The Overeater's Journal, Exercises for the Heart, Mind, and Soul. And next book is Why Can't My Child Stop Eating? A Guide to Helping Your Child Overcome Emotional Overeating. And her newest book, which just came out, is called Happy Eating and Food Addiction in American Advertising. And I read it, and we're going to include in our notes a discount for the book, and just let listeners know how they can achieve it. But let's start by talking about your books and writing and your work in food addiction. And we're going to talk about your journey later. But why did you decide to write the books?
Well, the first book that I wrote, I decided that I wanted to have a book in case I ever forgot who I was after I got out of treatment. So Why Can't I Stop Eating was written really for me. I wanted to remember, because that came out in 2000 and there just wasn't a lot about food addiction out then. And I wanted to be sure that I remembered where I came from and where I never wanted to go again. And then the rest of the books were written less selfishly to help other people. And the latest one was written with a focus on research. I wanted to do some academic research on the actual food advertisements that we see and see how the food addiction behaviors that were in those ads.
Yeah, we're going to get into a lot of the questions around this. It's a fascinating book that we'll talk about, but I'm going to go sort of in an outlined form and talk about your work, your journey, and then food addiction, and then we'll get into the book. But each of the books is a little different in terms of its focus, but they're all very good. You and I served as board members for a while together on the Food Addiction Institute board, and that website is foodaddictioninstitute.org. And I remember you then. And that was some great work I know you did and you do, and it's a great organization. In one of the books, the 90 Truths, you say a few things that you are not to blame for your weight problem, and photographs of yourself can be extremely valuable. And asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. And your imperfections are a part of you, and you are worth it. So talk about some of the truths.
Well, I think as a society, we have this idea that if we ask for help, we are weak and we should never ask for help, and we should have it all together and know how to do it. And that's just not true. It takes a lot of strength to ask for help when you need it. And I remember when I was at my lowest, if I hadn't asked for help, I don't believe I would be alive today. And that's, I was the way that I was going. I was 23 years old and I weighed over 300 pounds already. And I had no idea that food addiction existed. There was nothing out there to tell me that it existed. We're very lucky today that we have all this information, that we have these podcasts, that we have places like the InFact School and the Food Addiction Institute where people are educated. It wasn't like that, in 1989 when I was looking for help, and I was desperate. And I think the truths are really a different way to look at things, looking at pictures of myself from then. I only have a few because why would I take any pictures of myself when I hated the way I looked anyways? But looking at myself then reminds me of who I want to continue to be today, and
right.
We can find value in most things. And today there's more acceptance in the world for larger body sizes, but then there was not. And there was a lot of shame involved.
Right.
And, I'm grateful I have those pictures. So the truths are important to remember to, stay in recovery for me.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in 1989, really super thin was in. I think we've changed to the point of, more body fat and more curves are more accepted. And but still, I think being larger is more accepted today. Well, let's start talking about your personal recovery. One of the quotes from your book was, "Eating was the only way I knew to comfort myself. I put on a happy face. Then when I was alone and ate until I was so sick that I could barely make it to the bathroom in time, I was 328 pounds." So you weighed 328 pounds, and you say you experienced deep self-hatred and shame from not being able to control your eating, and that you were suicidal and hopeless. So talk about what that bottom was for you.
My bottom was the night before I went into treatment. I was laying on the floor and I had eaten something I didn't even like the taste of anymore. And I was crying. I was so desperate. And that was when I think about my bottom, that's my bottom. And, since that, once I went to treatment and found out about food addiction, that's been the driving force in just about everything I've done. I've made it possible to do that I teach classes that are about food advertising, and we talk about food addiction. I mean, it's the driving force in my academic research. It's the driving force in the books that I write, because I don't want anyone to go through that if they don't have to. It was horrible.
Yeah. Well, I understand you went to Glen Bay in Tampa, and that is where Phil Wardell really ran Glen Bay for a number of years. And unfortunately, Phil Wardell just passed away September 9th. He was a pioneer in food addiction and a prolific writer, a longtime advocate for the recognition of food addiction as a brain disease, real focus on powerlessness and denial. So I had the privilege of knowing him and working with him in the leadership training at Shift for a short while, and talk about what it was like when you went to Glen Bay and Phil was there and you went through treatment.
It was like being on another planet for me, because it was the exact opposite of everything that I ever lived in my life. We were put on a schedule, get up at 6 and, exercise and eat meals 4 hours apart. I didn't have any of that. I didn't have any structure or schedule. And, in a lot of ways on the outside, I looked like I was functioning, except for the fact that I was so overweight, but I wasn't. And expressing my feelings and talking, just living a healthy life was something I didn't know how to do. And Phil was amazing. He was one of my therapists, and through the years, right up until he passed away, we had been in touch and we had worked together on different things. He wrote the foreword for one of my books, and I don't know where I would be without him doing what he did. And that's what I think is important. One of the solutions to all the things that are going on in the world is to create awareness about food addiction. And he did that.
And he did that.
Grand scale.
Yeah. On a grand scale. And I remember he was a prolific writer, and I remember him saying, and of course he was on the Food Addiction Institute board. He started the Food Addiction Institute, and when he was on the board, he said, I have to write. Not that he feels called to write, he thinks he's good at it or whatever. He said he has to write. And it was really profound, that he said that, and he's a very good writer. But there are a couple of themes that Phil talked about that stuck with me. And I went through, Phil Wardell and Mary Fushi started Acorn, and it eventually has become Shift, as a company. And Amanda Leith, of course, owns Shift. And I went to the first intensive, the 5-day intensive, in May of 2019, when Amanda had just purchased the company from Phil and Mary. And so I went through the intensive as a student, but I was in the leadership training program with Phil. He was guiding me for a short while. And so I want to reference a couple of things that I learned in there that I know you learned as well. But there are two things that Phil emphasized, and one is denial. How are we living in denial? And he says the denial of addiction is the largest barrier to food addiction recovery. And it's true. Talk about denial and how perhaps you personally were in denial.
I honestly thought that at 328 pounds, I really didn't look all that bad, because I looked in the mirror from my neck up, and I thought I looked fine. And I walked around the first 2 weeks in treatment thinking I wasn't a food addict. And, denial is very powerful, but we also have a society that's set up, he talks about in his book about denial, about how our society is set up that way. And, advertisements and things like that are all part of it. We have not just our personal denial, but we have a system that supports denial. It's just food. It can't hurt you. I used to go to the dentist when I was younger, and the dentist would give you a lollipop, tell you not to eat a lot of sugar, but give you a lollipop after you were done,
Right.
I mean, they don't probably do that too much anymore, but but it's still, that's how our things are set up in our society, to deny the power and the danger of certain foods.
Yeah, really mixed messages. There's a commercial on TV that really kind of drives me crazy. There's a woman who is dancing, and she's probably a good 150 pounds overweight. And the advertisement is for a diabetes medication. And she's dancing and, like, I'm happy and all I have to do is take this pill. But she's obese, and that's where we've gone. And we'll talk about this food advertising in your book. But a few more things here around Phil. And he talks about negative consequences, that the denial, that we are perhaps well over our healthy body weight. We binge on a lot of different foods. Our clothes don't fit. Our families are worried about us. And like you say, photographs. I mean, I look back at the photographs now when I weighed over 200 pounds, and I think, I thought I didn't look that bad. I thought I was dressing well and I was okay, but
Mm-hmm.
I did look bad, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
denial. And it is very powerful to keep us from really facing, the food addiction that we have, right?
Mm-hmm. It's true. That's the number one issue. Just like Phil said, because for so many years, in my time, I didn't know about food addiction, but also just the idea that, I could think that I look okay. I weigh 328 pounds. My clothes, like you said, in those days, they didn't have clothes for people who were bigger. As you could get them, but they weren't very
That's right.
attractive, and they weren't, we didn't have what we have today. And I hated myself, and yet I still thought my life was okay. Everything was falling apart around me. And still I thought, oh, it's not
Mm-hmm.
that bad.
Right. Yeah. The other theme that Phil talks about, and he asks students to write about, and that is powerlessness. And you talked
Mm-hmm.
about the pressure on us that even though we can't stop from starting eating addictive foods like sugar, flour, ultra processed foods, and that we can't stop once we start, that we are powerless over it, that it's not our willpower. And it's not our fault, and that is something, like you said, we have to ask for help, and that's a very hard thing to do for some people, including me, which is I had trouble asking for help and saying, I give up. Food just beat me in a fair
Mm-hmm.
fight. And I think that sounds like your
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Absolutely. And because who wants to give up? We're not taught that way. That's not what our society tells us, keep going, try harder. In order to get in recovery, we have to give up.
Yeah, we have to surrender and then we get to work, right? I mean, we have to say,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do it. And that's what the 12-step recovery program tells us. I can't do it on my own. I need help. And when I finally said that after 43 years of dieting, losing weight, gaining it, then I could really admit it and be honest about it. The other thing, before we go into food addiction and your work, that I did at Shift that Phil asked us to do, Phil and Amanda at Shift, Acorn, was to list all of the foods we had ever binged on, which was
Mm-hmm.
really revealing to me. I had about 35 that I could remember, and I probably hadn't included all of them. But when there are foods where it's like once you start, you can't stop. And whether
Mm-hmm.
it's chips and salsa, pizza, M&Ms, whatever it is, these are addictive foods. And it sounds like you had trigger foods or addictive foods as well when you went into Glen Bay.
Absolutely. And we had to do that same exercise in Glen Bay too. And I had a pretty long list. And at first I thought, well, how can something like hot dogs, or how can something like, how can that be? That doesn't have sugar in it, but turns out it does. Most hot dogs do have sugar. And a lot of the things that I thought didn't fit into the food addiction that they were talking about really do have sugar in them, and you just wouldn't know it, or the fat or salt or any of the other things. And my list was pretty long
Mm-hmm.
too.
Yeah, I'm sure mine was longer, but those are things I do not eat today. So let's talk about some of your work and let's talk about food addiction. The obesity statistics you reference in your book, and Food Addiction Institute says this, you say 87 million Americans struggle with obesity, and as many as half of them suffer from food addiction, which the thing about this is, okay, 87 million Americans, and I think we've got, call it 300 million Americans in the country. It's give or take. So that's about a third. And so to
Mhm.
me, I keep hearing that, well, addicts, if you're an addict, it's 10% of the population. We say that in other 12-step alcohol programs where we say 10% of people are addicted, and it's got to be higher than that. If 87 million Americans struggle with obesity, isn't the percentage of food addiction higher than 10%?
Absolutely. What is our percentage of obesity? When we look at the percentage, I think we're going to pretty much, I think, approach 50% very soon. 50% of the population will be overweight or obese. And so to me, that tells me more than the statistic about addiction, because I think with food, it's different. Food addiction is not an identified, well-known if you're an alcoholic, you know where to go, you know what to do, help is available to you. If you're a food addict, you have to search for help. It's not well known. It's not,
Yes.
it's not out there. And I think that we don't really know how many people are, that's the Food Addiction Institute's figure, and I accept it, and I probably think it's even higher. I would go closer to the obesity, overweight predictions that we have, but there's no really way to know for sure.
There's no way to really know. I mean, obesity, we know in my work in the podcast, we know that obesity is a symptom of food addiction, but not
Mhm.
all obese people are food addicts. Not all food
Mhm.
addicts are obese. And there's a lot, we're going to talk about the differences in emotional eating and food addiction a little bit later, but it's confusing at best. One of the quotes from the book I like that you talk about food addiction, you say about food addiction, the most common addictive eating behaviors are binging, purging, and volume eating. Food addiction is a chronic and progressive disease characterized by our seeking the foods or food behaviors we are addicted to, eating, doing them compulsively, and having a great deal of difficulty controlling these urges despite harmful consequences. And we say in 12-step, recovery that these are negative consequences like obesity, things that interfere with our lives, right? So talk about food addiction.
I think that the easiest way to think about it is when you see an alcoholic who's falling down drunk, can't hold a job, and is you know spending too much money on alcohol. And it's the same thing for food addiction. We just don't think of food that way, and I think that's the biggest issue. And if for me, I was only 23 years old, and I was in graduate school when I got in recovery, so I didn't have a lot of the financial consequences because I wasn't supporting myself at that point in time. And but I could have easily lost a lot of things in my life because of spending money on food, being preoccupied with food. I had trouble even just getting myself to classes. I couldn't focus. The focus, we don't talk a lot about the consequences of not being able to focus on anything, of not being able to sometimes just get out of bed. Those are all symptoms of food addiction that maybe we don't think about them as being symptoms of food addiction. We
Right.
look in some of the things that are portrayed in our society. We look and see, in some of these commercials, I'll just be good to myself, I'll have a chocolate bar. Well, that chocolate bar might not make you be able to get up out of bed the next day, but we're not going to see that in the commercial. We're just going to say, I'll be good to myself. And then the next day when we have a hangover from the too much sugar, that's not going to be shown.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's important to understand in food addiction what happens with the brain chemistry, which is altered when we eat addictive substances. And the food addict, like me, like you, experiences strong, powerful cravings, driving us to eat more and more food and even more to get the same effect. And some of the characteristics you cite as being a possible food addict are, and I had this most of my life, difficulty maintaining a normal body weight. Food addicts seek pleasure from food and escape, more or less numb out, and then using food to relieve emotional discomfort. And then night eating. I was a nocturnal eater. I would have trouble sleeping. I'd wake up and eat and go back to sleep. So those are some of the characteristics, right, of a food addict.
Absolutely. They are. And I think, lying to get the food, isolating, eating more than is what would be considered normal in a sitting, doing anything to get that food, and using that food in ways that isn't healthy. We're taught, oh, we should take care of ourselves, but the ways that we're taught to take care of ourselves aren't necessarily healthy. There was one of the things, the commercials I watched, where the mother shut the door and she pretended that she wasn't there for her kids because she just wanted to sit there and eat her ice cream or her chocolate bar. And
Yeah.
that's supposed to be a way of taking care of herself. Well, I would have rather have seen a woman who was, getting herself a massage or something rather than sitting there eating something, an ultra processed food item.
Right. Yeah, we're going to dive into some of that, and it's as we talk about your book. But let's talk about the difference in food addiction and emotional eating. It's confusing because there are overlaps. All food addicts are emotional eaters, but not all emotional eaters are food addicts, you say. And you define the two. You say food addiction is a term used to describe the physical, emotional addiction to certain food substances, usually processed foods, sugar, flour, caffeine, sometimes fat and wheat. Emotional eating, you say, you distinguish by saying it is used to label the condition of using food to manage feelings. So, talk about the difference.
For me, the biggest difference that I've seen is that a food addict has an overwhelming desire to consume certain substances that can't be controlled once they have that substance in their body. Emotional eaters might turn to food when they feel sad or when they're happy, but they can leave it. They can, they can stop eating, where a food addict just can't stop no matter what. They
Right,
may say, oh, I'll stop tomorrow, or I'll, you know but they can't. And that's the big difference, is the
right.
physical biological cravings.
You talk about the Nova scale in the book, and it's a measure of how processed foods are. And I think one of the best examples I've heard with the Nova scale, and it's a 1 to 4 scale, I believe, where an unprocessed real food is an apple as a
Mhm.
1. And then on the 4 scale, it would be an apple pie at McDonald's. So the apple goes through all these gyrations to be something which is not real food. Yeah, you've got some apples in there, but and you might think you're being healthy by eating an apple pie, but the Nova scale measures ultra processed foods. So I'm going to give you an invitation to talk about that, but you reference different types of ultra processed foods, which is frankly most of the foods in the grocery are what are called foods: cereal, candy,
Mhm.
ice cream, fruit yogurts, pizzas, sausages, hot dogs, soups, energy and cereal bars, carbonated and fruit drinks, breads, cakes, cookies. They're all sugar filled, ultra processed, and we call them food, but they're not real food. So, talk about the Nova scale and real food.
Right. The scale outlines the different processing, as you've just said, but there's nothing wrong with processed foods, as far as, that apple cut up could be a processed food. If you buy the apple
Hmm.
slices, then that's a processed food. And it's when we get into the ultra processing that really, it's not even really food anymore. There's a new book out, Ultra Processed People, by Chris Van Tulliken, and it's amazing the way that he talks about he actually went to places where they process the food, and he talks about the processing of it. And the way that they actually strip out all the nutrients, and then in the case of, say, a yogurt or a fruit leather type product, they take that food and they take everything that's good about it, all the nutrients, and they strip it out so that it will last longer, and the concentration of it will actually cause cravings in someone who is addicted to food, because of they've taken all the juices and the sweetness, and it's almost like um, making taking 10 apples to make one small part of that product, and it's just so
Right.
sweet that it will cause cravings. So the Nova scale is, it hasn't been around that long, but it was a real discovery when it was discovered in Brazil. And because Brazil didn't have the obesity problem that we did early on, and when they actually got to have an obesity problem, there was a researcher who wanted to look at that and look at what was happening. And that was how he was able to figure out, it was a team of researchers. They were able to figure out, this is why
Hmm.
people are gaining weight, because these are not real foods, and our body is not made to process these foods. And it causes us to gain weight. And also for food addicts, it causes cravings.
Right. I think it's important, the Nova scale, to identify what foods might be addictive, what are ultra processed foods, and what might be addictive and we'll talk about the work being done to get food addiction approved as a substance use disorder a little bit later. But it's important that Nova scale is important, I think, in that. One of the things in the book you say is It is important to note that physical and emotional cravings experienced by food addicts make it nearly impossible to achieve a relaxed state of being. The combination of physical urges driven by brain chemistry, along with the shame and powerlessness of not being able to resist eating unhealthy foods despite best efforts, results in an unsuccessful quest for peace of mind and not possible without experiencing recovery from food addiction. There's a lot here. And so, kind of a real life example, I may have 5 packs of M&Ms in my house. I eat 1 pack and say, I only want to eat 1 pack today, and that's all I'm going to do. I promise myself I will do that.
Mhm.
An hour later,
Mhm.
I may be craving more, and I'm thinking, okay, one more, and then I'm done. So it's like the mind. I'm obsessed with it. There's a physical craving, my brain chemistry. I don't have peace of mind, and once I start
Right.
eating it, I can't stop as much as I want to. So that's what the powerlessness is of a food addict. If you want to address that.
Yes, and that's absolutely right. I mean, there is no peace when you're an addict of any kind. You don't find peace, and because there's always going to be that physical craving. And I think that the part that really angers me is that there are commercials that promise relaxation from eating ultra processed foods when someone who's a food addict can never achieve that. And so the danger there is that
Yeah.
that first, like, if you convince yourself that you need to have like a Dove ice cream bar, or you need to have a, whatever it is to relax because you've seen it in the commercial, then you go and eat it, and you've started that cycle over and over again. So relaxation, if you're a food addict, is not possible. And I think that's where the denial
Right.
aspect comes in too. It's like this horrible cycle that's created.
There's a lot of deception, and we're going to talk about your book now, Happy Eating, Food Industry, and Advertising. And I'll start with a quote from your book. It says, to identify and transform cultural mechanisms contributed to the current epidemic of eating and body image problems, deconstructing the potentially harmful messages in food advertisements is essential. And you say, the food industry uses seduction and persuasion techniques to entice consumers to buy products based on achieving some desirable goal, even if it's unrealistic. So, what was your hope
Mhm.
in writing the book?
To create awareness. I wanted to create awareness because I
Yeah.
believe this is the area that no one looks at when we talk about food addiction recovery, when we talk about obesity, when we talk about all those things. Nobody's looking at the food ads and looking at the behaviors that are being, not only to adults but to children as well. We have the Rudd Center, and they look at some of the things that are going on, but to really critically analyze these commercials, to know the messages that are being sent out, the promises that are being made if you eat this food, which are not possible from eating ultra processed food. I mean, we have created this climate of denial around our food advertisements, around food. I mean, experts say that we see between 3,000 and 5,000 advertisements every day. So, that counts
Wow.
like the logos and the things, but that's a lot of power that we give to these things. And, probably I'd say at least half of those, maybe even more. I'd probably say a lot more, but are food advertisements. So if we are being told 1 bite won't hurt us, take this, you can relax. If you eat this, you don't have to exercise. This is healthy. You'll eat this and be smart. We're going to believe those things, whether we think we will or not.
Right. Yeah, we're going to get into that and Madison Avenue, and that's what marketing companies do. Advertisements, advertising. You give some very specific and detailed examples, many of them in the book. Some going back many years, some from really even the 30s when Wheaties came out, the cereal
Mhm.
Wheaties. Some are from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and I remember many of these. You describe
Mhm.
the age and gender and often the ethnicity of the people in the ads. How did you gather this information, and why do you think it's important to be so specific about what's in there?
I watched a lot of advertisements, and there's a lot available. There's a lot available online, and I searched and I looked and I watched. I would guess I probably watched over 500 advertisements, and I didn't just watch them once. And there were many, many more
Yeah.
advertisements that I watched than could be included in the book. And I think it's important to be specific because as the advertising industry has grown, we have food advertisements now where we include people in them with obesity almost as a way to massage that denial. Like, well, she's, or
Yeah.
he is overweight and it's okay to eat this and make it even more
Yeah.
acceptable. And in the beginning, we didn't have that. You could just see the growth of the advertising industry over time.
Right. That more and more people in the commercials are overweight versus thin.
Mhm. Yeah, and also different ethnicities and different techniques, different messages. We put pictures of real fruit in with candy to say it's cherry flavored candy. So if you see the cherries, then doesn't that mean it's healthy? I mean, those are the kinds of tricks
Hmm.
that happen, but they've been happening for decades. Just they're more
They
sophisticated
have,
now.
and yeah, they are. And here's the thing. I mean, I'm a business person. I was in business for many years, and the whole thing about marketing and advertising, the food industry is huge. It's gargantuan. And what does the food industry want? What does Coca-Cola want? What is Kraft? They want to be able to entice consumers to connect with this food, and feel like they will be something different. They will do something different. There's an emotional connection. I want to be that way. I want to be like her. And that's what advertisers do, and it works. So I don't think that you can fight City Hall on that. This is going to happen. It's going to continue to happen, and it's deceptive. But I do think that there are some things that can be done. But what would you say about the deception that goes on, and all the connections that advertisers try to make with the products so they can be sold?
I would say the first thing to do is be aware of it. And that's the point behind this book, these podcasts, every other thing is to be aware of these tricks and these messages and how untrue they are. That for me is like the starting point. It's again, everything I do centers on that. I teach media literacy.
Yeah.
That means we're going to understand what these messages are. And it's not just about food, it's about everything. Is it really true that if you eat this, you're going to be smarter? Smart food popcorn. Is that going to make you smarter? Really? And they put that in the commercial. They have a smart
Yeah.
looking person who, becomes smart from eating the popcorn. And that's not going to happen. And
Right.
I think if we start talking to people at a young age about, in my opinion, we should have media literacy curriculum in a literacy curriculum in every single school across the country, starting with elementary school every year, all the way through, because advertising has that kind of power. Even if we think it doesn't, people say, oh, advertising doesn't affect me. It doesn't matter. Well, we have research that shows that food advertisements make people eat more. I mean, and
Yeah.
that to me right there tells you everything you need to know.
Right. Yeah, you make a lot of connections between what the advertisers are doing, what they're saying, and how they get the consumer kind of hooked in to buy the products. Some interesting things. For example, that emotional connection with food, the connection to being physically fit and strong, exercise, movement, rebellion, which I thought was interesting. And then sports figures. There were 850 different athletes on the front of Wheaties. Fun,
Mm-hmm.
cool, exciting, having only positive outcomes, thin people having fun, but they're eating ultra processed foods, and taking a break
Mm-hmm.
from the grind. And then the big use of mascots, and then showing love through food. So you give a lot of great examples of the actual advertisement and then how they're doing it, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's very tricky. You have to really, unless you're someone like me who does this and studies countless advertisements and looks at them closely, you kind of just let it go by. But it gets into your subconscious mind, and you think, "Gee, that looks good."
Hmm.
Or there were a couple of ads where they're dancing with their ice cream. Is that who dances with their ice cream? But it's happy, it's upbeat, and we're thinking, "Gee, that's fun." And I think
Yeah.
probably the area that concerns me the most is that it's the health one, where they make the unhealthy food look so pretend to be healthy, and they make it appear that way, like you said, with the exercise. And
Yeah.
it's tricky, and you have to really pay attention to it.
Yeah. And they're doing it with children, as you've said, and you've got one book just focused on children, and they've been marketing to children for years to sell early and encourage children as they watch the commercials to get their parents to buy these sugary, high processed foods. And we know that children today, more than ever, are experiencing metabolic outcomes like too much sugar leading to fatty liver disease, diabetes, heart disease, inflammatory conditions, asthma, acne, and early obesity. I've seen more overweight kids today than I've ever seen before, and they're really setting themselves up to be obese adults.
Yes, they are. And I think that's think about think about Tony the Tiger. He's there to entice kids to eat a cereal that's filled with sugar. That's his sole purpose. No matter how you pretty it up, that's the sole purpose.
And we know this, and I think you probably know it, but I've talked to others on this podcast. We have evidence that the food industry and the drink industry, like Coca-Cola, that has sugar in their drinks, they know that sugar is bad for us. They know that ultra-processed food is bad for us, and yet they continue to sell it. And there are 262 different names for sugar that's added. And you may say, oh, there's no sugar in this, but there may be some thing like dextrose or some other thing that's called that you don't even know it's sugar. But the food industry, we know, knows this, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I know there was Michael Moss writes in his book Hooked about how he attended, this advertising convention, and they talked about how they measure brainwaves to, find the point where the taste of it affects us most. And then they take that and they make an advertisement and they measure where the advertisement affects you most. So we don't really stand a chance if these food manufacturers are measuring our brainwaves to see first where we're going to enjoy, like where our bliss point is with the eating the food, and then our emotional appeal where it grabs us in the commercial. How can we fight that? The only way is to become aware of what they're doing.
Right. And find recovery, which you have found and I have found. And if you're a late stage food addict like I was, and I think I can say this, that you were, you're eating not for the pleasure or the numb feeling to get away from whatever you're trying to get away from, but you're eating because you have to, and you're eating because you don't want to withdraw from it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And these advertisements are enticing you to eat more and more and more.
Eat more. Yeah. It's really a conspiracy. I hate to say it, but I think it's true. So let's talk about what you talked about is, I'm a big believer in personal responsibility. It's not the food industry's fault. It's not the advertiser's fault that I might weigh 203 pounds. It's not their fault. Once I know what's going on, I can't unknow it. And then it becomes my responsibility to make a change. And you did it 34 years ago. I did it 7 years ago, which is basically, I can't do this on my own. I need help. I'm going to seek 12-step recovery, maybe treatment through a company called Shift, foodaddiction.com. But you say in here, and I really like this, you are not to blame for your weight problem, but it is your responsibility. Yes, there is deception, but every person, I believe, has a personal responsibility to read labels, to know that a lot of this is unhealthy, that it's not true, that this is persuasion, seduction to get you to buy the food. But you have to take responsibility for your own life and your own children, for that matter. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think also you have to be aware, because you can't take responsibility for something you're not aware of. And I think that, this is where spreading the awareness is so important. Once you know, as you said, then you need to take responsibility, because we're not going to change the advertising industry. There's no way.
No.
But we can educate people, and that will make the difference.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about this. My daughter is very good about reading labels and making sure she understands what her kids are eating and what she's eating and so forth. Not everybody does that, and that goes to
Mhm.
the denial, I think. And we're going to talk about the DSM-5 as we sort of wrap up here. But what do you think can be done in this around the FDA or making the consumer more aware? I mean, you're not going to see a commercial where you say, "Hey, look at the Frosted Flakes label. You see sugar as the first ingredient. You don't want to eat this." They're not going to say that. So, what does the FDA need to do, or other government agencies in this regard?
Well, we should regulate some of the food substances that we actually put in our body, but I don't have a lot of hope for that. I think that it needs to
Yeah,
come from the schools, and I think it needs to come from,
yeah,
if the FDA really wanted to do something, they could create an educational program, but I don't know. I know for me, in my experience, when I teach my food advertising class and students read some of these things and they learn about food addiction and they learn about the tricks in the advertisements and the food substances, they're shocked at what they're putting into their bodies. And these are college students.
yeah,
So if we can get them younger to understand how dangerous these substances are and the advertising techniques. There's a study. One of my colleagues did a study, and she found Dr. Bindig Yausman. She showed that media literacy education can be beneficial in eating disorder recovery treatment. It's the actual, results that it does help when people are media literacy aware of what we're seeing, then they think about it. Maybe not. It might not change
yeah.
their behavior. I still have students say, well, I like my occasional, whatever, but that's okay. But at least they know what they're doing. And I think that's the answer there.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Let's talk about the DSM-5. I know the APA had a meeting in San Francisco in 2023, and I've heard that 95% plus of the people that would vote for food addiction as a substance use disorder agreed that it is. And so we're getting there, but
Hmm.
we're still a ways off. So talk about that and how that might change the landscape.
I believe that acceptance in the DSM would be a game changer because then food addiction recovery would be covered by insurances. We would have the awareness, at least a starting point of an awareness, because most mental health professionals don't understand food addiction. And it's even today, it's kind of like luck if you find somebody who refers you to a place that will help you. I still get emails from my first book written in 2000 about, where can I go? I'm at the end of my rope. I don't know how to get help. And, you know, it shouldn't be that way. And I think if food addiction is
Right.
included as a substance use disorder, then we at least have a shot at people understanding and knowing the dangers of this and
Hmm.
characteristics and symptoms and most of all treatment, treatment protocols.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are certain requirements, four categories: addictive, behavioral, emotional, physical. There are a lot of requirements in this to be classified as a substance use disorder, like alcohol or drugs. But there's a part of me that wants to believe that if it's passed, if it's in there in the DSM, that then obesity will go away. But still, we get back to
Mm.
the fact that people have to say, I've got a problem, and it is food addiction. And yes, I need treatment. I'm going to go here, and insurance is going to pay for it. I don't know that it's going to be that cut and dry. I mean, that's just sort
Mm.
of a dream of mine that it would happen that way. But it will increase the
Mm.
awareness, but it's not going to solve the obesity problem until people do look in the mirror
Mm.
and admit they have a problem.
Well, it's sort of like
Yeah.
with alcoholism. Just because it's in there doesn't mean that there aren't any more alcoholics, but at least,
Right.
I respect if someone doesn't want to get help, then that's their choice. But at least they know their options, and
Hmm.
we don't even have that with food addiction.
Right. Well, as we close out, Debbie, it's been great. One more question. What would you say to someone who has trouble with food, uses it emotionally, can't seem to stop once they start, use volume eating, who binge, perhaps obese, overweight, who have tried to diet and eventually fail over and over? What would you say to that person today?
I'd say that there is hope, that there is treatment, but you have to want it. if you haven't hit a bottom yet, there's nothing that I could ever say that would change anything. But if you're ready for help, there's help out there. There's plenty of help. Mm-hmm. And if you're watching this podcast, you already know about a lot of the help because we've mentioned, a lot of it in this podcast. Right. So I would say, do it. You're worth it.
And there are 12-step recovery programs outlined at infactschool.com. They're on there. Recovery is possible. And, you're down 170 pounds. I'm down 70 pounds. And this life I never would have dreamed of. Mm-hmm. Debbie, it's been great. Thank you for being a guest today. And thank you for your work. I know Esther has a lot of respect for you. The book, Happy Eating and Food Addiction in American Advertising. It's very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the Food Addiction Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the podcast and learned more about this disease. We hope you will rate and write a review on this podcast and share it with others. If you or someone you know is suffering from the disease of food addiction, there is a solution. The various food addiction recovery programs are available and listed on the website, theinfactschool.com. Or if you would like to know more about how to get certified in treating food addiction, the school is accepting applications now for its next training beginning in September 2023. Go to theinfactschool.com. That's INFACT school.com to learn more.
Are you passionate about helping others overcome food addiction? Do you dream of making a real difference in people's lives? Look no further than the InFact School, the first and only program that offers an accredited international professional certification for food addiction professionals. With over 170 hours of engaging and informative online virtual teaching sessions, you'll delve deep into the world of food addiction and gain the knowledge and skills needed to make a lasting impact. Our experienced instructors, who are leading experts in the field, will guide you through the latest research and evidence-based practices. The InFact School goes beyond theory and equips you with the hands-on skills you need to support individuals on their journey to recovery. You'll gain invaluable experience working directly with clients under the supervision of our faculty. Upon completion of our program, you'll be a certified food addiction professional, ready to make a positive impact in the lives of those struggling with food addiction. Join the InFact School today and be a part of the solution. Together, let's conquer food addiction and build a healthier future for all. Visit our website at www.infactschool.com to learn more and enroll in our professional training program. The journey starts here at the InFact School.